One of the most crucial turning points in World War II took place in June 1942, when the United States Navy achieved a stunning victory over the Imperial Japanese Navy at the Battle of Midway. This battle, which lasted from June 4 to June 7, 1942, is widely regarded as one of the most significant naval battles in history, as it marked a dramatic shift in the balance of power in the Pacific theater. The prelude, the Japanese strategy. By 1942, Japan had already made significant territorial gains in the Pacific, having attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941 and quickly capturing much of Southeast Asia, the Philippines, and other Pacific islands. The Japanese Navy, led by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, had inflicted devastating losses on the United States in the early stages of the war. Japan's goal was to weaken the U.S. Pacific Fleet and seize control of the Pacific Ocean. The Japanese had their sights set on the Midway Atoll, a tiny group of islands located about halfway between Japan and the U.S. West Coast. Midway was considered an important strategic point, and Yamamoto believed that by capturing it, Japan could extend its defensive perimeter and lure the remaining American aircraft carriers into a trap, thus wiping out the U.S. Navy's ability to retaliate. However, what the Japanese didn't know was that the United States Navy had already cracked part of their code and was aware of their plans to attack Midway. Breaking the code, the role of intelligence. The critical factor that led to the American victory at Midway was the work of U.S. Navy cryptanalysts who had broken the Japanese naval codes earlier in the year. This allowed the U.S. Navy to anticipate Japan's movements and gain invaluable insight into the Japanese fleet's intentions. In particular, the Americans were able to decipher the Japanese message indicating that Midway was the target. Armed with this knowledge, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, devised a plan to ambush the Japanese attack. Nimitz's strategy involved laying in wait and using his limited forces to strike decisively once the Japanese had committed to the battle. The Americans managed to gather a fleet of 3 aircraft carriers, the USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown, to defend Midway. The aircraft carriers were crucial because they allowed for long-range strikes using planes, which would be pivotal in sinking the larger, slower battleships of the Japanese fleet. The battle, June 4, 1942. On June 4, 1942, the Japanese fleet arrived off the coast of Midway, unaware that the U.S. carriers were waiting for them. Initially, the Japanese launched airstrikes on the island in an attempt to neutralize its defenses, but they encountered fierce resistance. Midway's defenses, including American bombers and fighter planes, managed to hold off the initial Japanese attacks and buy valuable time. As the Japanese forces continued their attacks on Midway, they became overconfident and left themselves vulnerable. The turning point came when the American planes, including dive bombers from the USS Yorktown and USS Enterprise, were able to launch an unexpected attack on the Japanese fleet. The Americans found the Japanese aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, part of the core of the Japanese strike force, unprotected by their own aircraft, as most of the Japanese planes were in the air, attacking Midway. The American bombers swooped down, delivering a series of devastating blows. The sinking of Japanese aircraft carriers. In a matter of minutes, the 3 Japanese carriers were set ablaze and sank. The loss of these carriers was catastrophic for Japan. The Akagi was the flagship of the Japanese fleet, and the Kaga and Soryu were also among Japan's most powerful vessels. These carriers had been critical to Japan's naval superiority in the Pacific. The Japanese had suffered a devastating loss of aircraft, pilots, and equipment, crucial assets that could not be replaced quickly. The USS Yorktown was also severely damaged in the battle, but despite the damage, it managed to remain afloat long enough to be able to continue contributing to the fight before sinking later. The Japanese also lost more than 250 aircraft, while the Americans lost only about 150. The aftermath, a turning point in the Pacific War. By the end of the Battle of Midway, Japan had lost 4 aircraft carriers, a cruiser, and hundreds of aircraft, while the United States lost the USS Yorktown and a smaller number of planes. The battle was a decisive American victory, and it drastically altered the course of the war in the Pacific. The loss of these carriers and the trained pilots that went with them severely weakened Japan's offensive capabilities. The battle shattered Japan's ability to conduct large-scale offensive operations in the Pacific and shifted the momentum of the war in favor of the Allies. In the months following Midway, the United States began a strategy of island hopping, systematically capturing key islands and moving closer to Japan. The victory at Midway also gave the U.S. Navy a much-needed morale boost and demonstrated the importance of intelligence and strategic planning in modern warfare. The Battle of Midway is often hailed as one of the greatest naval battles in history, not only for its strategic impact but also because it demonstrated the power of intelligence and preparation. The United States' ability to crack Japan's naval code and anticipate their moves was a key factor in the victory. The battle also marked the beginning of the end for Japan's imperial ambitions in the Pacific. While the war would continue for another 3 years, the Battle of Midway had decisively turned the tide in favor of the Allies.